invoke executive privilege to prevent James Comey from testifying before the Senate Intelligence Panel next week.
The date for that hearing was just set. I have not spoken to counsel yet. I don't know how they're going to respond.
White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer not answering whether the White House will try to block the former FBI director from talking to Congress on Thursday. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Fox News senior political analyst Brit Hume, columnist for The Hill, Juan Williams, Julie Pace, who covers the White House for the Associated Press, and Jason Riley from the Wall Street Journal. Well, Julie, as we say, the White House refuses to say, but the New York Times is reporting over the weekend that the president is unlikely to invoke in executive privilege to block Comey from testifying. One, because it would be a PR disaster, and two, because his legal case is kind of weak. Question, what are you hearing from your sources?
Well, as recently as this morning, what I've heard is that the president is leaning toward not invoking executive privilege for Comey's testimony, but this is still an open decision. This is something that is going to be discussed in the coming days. And as we all know, with this president, it's not a final decision until it really comes.
Why are they fooling around with this?
I think there are a couple reasons. I think one, it actually is a discussion because they are worried about what Comey could potentially say, but they also recognize that if you do invoke executive privilege, just the optics of that makes it look like you're hiding something, makes it look like whatever Comey might say is going to be problematic for the president. They think they have a little bit of a wiggle room here. I think if they don't invoke executive privilege and Comey does say something that is damaging to the president, what you're going to hear administration officials point out is that in previous testimony that Comey has done on Capitol Hill, the FBI has had to correct it, that there have been questions about things that he said. I think that's the argument that they're going to be starting to make. But again, leaning toward no, still an open discussion.
We ask you for questions for the panel, and we got a bunch on just this issue. Here's one we got on Twitter from Hate Dirty Politics. Why did Comey, wait so long to come out and say he was threatened by POTUS? Why after he was fired? And is this revenge for being fired? Jason, I have to say, a lot of our viewers are asking, why didn't Comey either resign or blow the whistle as soon as he believed the president was somehow trying to impede his investigation?
It's an excellent question. Instead, he simply took some notes and shared them with a few people. But if he really thought that Trump had engaged in obstruction of justice, I think he had a duty to come forward and report that to higher officials in the Justice Department and certainly go public with it. He didn't do that, which suggests to me that he didn't think what Trump did really amounted to obstruction of justice, right?
Remember this, Chris, about obstruction of justice. It has to be an impeding an investigation in a corrupt way, which is to say for political reasons or some other illegitimate reason. To ask an FBI director, is from what we know of the meeting, that if it's, if he could see his way clear to letting the investigation go, since this is about Mike Flynn. Flynn had just been fired. My guess is that Comey looked at that and took the view that he was being asked if he could do it, if he could see, and his view was he couldn't see his way clear to do that. He didn't do it, and then you later had testimony from him and also from his deputy that said there'd been no effort to impede the investigation. So I suspect that, as Jason says, Comey did not think there was obstruction of justice involved here, or he would have said so. And this is a guy who's proved more than once that he's always ready to threaten to quit. He does that all the time. And by the way, the viewer's question said, did he threaten Comey? He didn't threaten Comey that we know of.
Juan?
Well, I think if Comey had come forward and done that at that moment, it would have been grandstanding and it would have impeded the ongoing investigation. So I don't think, even if he saw it as constituting obstruction of justice, it would have been appropriate. What was appropriate was to make it part of the investigation and see where it went from there. I think, though, at this point, there's so much fear in the White House of what is coming. They have now formed their own group to try to get ahead of this curve. But this remains a dark cloud over the president.
Britt, there's the legal issue as to whether it's obstruction of justice. There's also the political issue. You and I have covered a lot of these big hearings where all of Washington and a lot of the country stops and waits to see the key witness raise his hand and take the oath. How potentially politically damaging, maybe not legally, not a case for prosecution, but how politically damaging could this potentially be?
It could be damaging, but I don't think Juan's explanation holds up very well, and I don't think Comey's in any position to come in and say, yeah, he tried to obstruct justice and I kept quiet about it. I don't think that won't work in my view. And the other factor we have to keep in mind—
but if he just says what he supposedly wrote in this memo, it's damaging.
But that's already out there. Whatever damage has been done on that it might be reinforced for a couple of days, but that doesn't really change the atmosphere or move the ball very much. And remember this, Chris. He will be under the same strictures as he was when he was in office about discussions of an ongoing investigation. He really can't do that much, which is why I think this hearing, like so many others before it, will probably not quite live up to its billing, although the coverage is going to be unbelievable.
And one of the important things to keep in mind is that the amount of damage that this hearing creates is tied to how the president responds. The president is going to be watching this hearing like everybody else, and we've seen that he has an inability to prevent himself from reacting. So if he is tweeting in real time, if he is giving interviews after where he's weighing in.
You hope he does that, don't you?
You know, as a journalist, we always like to hear. We always like to hear from the president. But some of the damage will be within his control.
Jason,
that's the damage. Sean Spicer, White House press spokesman, came out, said we wanted to talk about infrastructure this week. How much are we going to be talking about infrastructure with this hearing going on this week? That's the political damage. It keeps this in the news, and instead of being focused on advancing an agenda on whether it's infrastructure or healthcare reform or tax reform, we're talking about the drip, drip, drip from this investigation.
You know, Bob Mueller would not be a special counsel in this deal if we didn't have word of just this kind of interaction between Comey and the president and the pressure on Jeff Sessions.
I don't think we have any way of knowing if that's true.
I think that's
Remember,
true.
Ron, this is primarily and has always been described as a counterintelligence investigation.
Correct.
To get to the bottom of what the Russians tried to do to hack the election. And of course, as a part of that, but just a part, was the question of whether there had been collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians. So that's a piece of it, but it's not the main thrust of it necessarily.
But it is, and it has tremendous political damage, tremendous collateral damage for the president. And the reason we're discussing obstruction of justice and whether or not it would have been inappropriate for Jim Comey to come forward at that moment is because this investigation continues. In fact, it's escalated, Britt.
I would agree with that entirely, which is another reason why I have said and will say again that this case has traveled farther on less evidence, I'm talking about the collusion piece of it, than any scandal I think I've ever seen.
But you know that, in fact, the intelligence agencies have said Russia definitely interfered in this election.
What's the underlying crime?
The underlying crime, potentially, and that's why I disagree with you, would be obstruction of justice by the President of the United States.
There's been one crime identified, and Mike Flynn was the victim of the leaking of his unmasked name.
You think that's the crime?
That's the only crime that's been so far identified.
And Mike Flynn meeting with the Russian ambassador to try to undercut the Obama sanctions, that doesn't bother you?
That's not a crime.
Oh, okay.
All right. In any case, you know, this is kind of a Fox News Sunday panel classic. Juan and Britt going back at it again. As we mentioned earlier, President Trump made a new push last night for his travel ban in a tweet while the attack in London was still unfolding. He's taking the case to the Supreme Court. Here's what Vice President Pence had to say this week.
The ability to come into the United States of America is a privilege, not a right.
Jason, does this latest attack add new impetus to the president's call for a travel ban?
I don't think it does. He clearly does. I mean, he was linking it in his tweets. But the United Kingdom is not part of the list of countries that would be subjected to the ban, A. And B, again, as previous guests earlier said, Senator Blunt, I believe, mostly these are homegrown folks. That Manchester bomber was someone who had been born and raised in Manchester, and so on. And here domestically, a lot of you talk to the Homeland Security officials, that's what they're worried about, people already here being radicalized. And then you see the timeline that the administration laid out for this temporary ban. They wanted several months. They've had several months. So no, I don't think. What struck me about this, though, is Trump again tweeting and talking about this publicly. And that has been a problem in these court cases that have come up so far. The judges have been throwing his words back at him, saying they speak to a state of mind here. And I think that, again, he has to be more disciplined in how he talks about this issue.
Julie, I'm going to pick up on that because the whole ban, which was put out, the original ban on January 27th, 1 week in, talked about 90-day delay, 120-day delay, while they put together an extreme vetting plan. We're now 130 days into this administration. Why didn't they put together the extreme vetting plan so they don't have to worry about a ban?
It's a great question. That extreme vetting plan is essentially nowhere. And what we were told at the end of that first week is that the rushed rollout of the original ban was because the threat was so urgent. And certainly, I think that argument has been undermined by the fact that there hasn't been a major attack in the U.S. during that period, and that the administration has not moved quickly on the extreme vetting. And just to Jason's point there, and it ties back into what we were talking about with Comey, the White House has been focused on this idea that this is not a travel ban. They don't want to use this language. And then the president last night puts that language back out on the table.
Panel, thank you. See you next week. And we'll be right back with a final word.